Welcome to the second episode of CJ Adrien's Critical Thinking Lab. I'm your host, CJ Adrien, which I guess is in the title. You may have noticed I shaved my beard. Why? Because it itched. I don't usually have a beard. I was just being lazy. Let's move on. So today's episode, I am going to base off of a meme. I know, Critical Thinking Lab. And you're going to use a meme? Yes, but they're funny. They're funny. So the meme I have for you today is thus. So in this meme, we see that Prince Harry and his wife, Meghan Markle, are being interviewed, a famous Oprah interview, I believe. But the caption has been changed to say, "From Harry, we left England because we learned I had been lied to my whole life. I was told it was the 100 Years' War, but it was 3 separate conflicts across 116 years. Now, this is funny for 2 reasons. Number 1, the 100 Years' War wasn't 100 years, and well, most of us know that, but it was also separated into 3 phases, so it does make it kind of confusing, right? Was it one long war? Was it 3 separate smaller wars? How does it fit into the context of all the other wars that England and France fought before and after, right? So it plays on the muddiness of how the 100 Years' War is delineated. But I also think it's funny because it sort of kind of speaks to Prince Harry's, thing where he might not be Charles's son and he's a spitting image of Princess Diana's bodyguard. And so he was probably lied to, as was the royal family. And well, let's just leave it there. So back to the 100 Years' War. How on earth did we end up with a war with 100 years in the title, but that lasted more than 100 years? Well, to understand that, we need to understand historians in general, specifically 19th century historians. You see, the 19th century was this wonderful time when universities and institutions started to invest more heavily in the study of the past, notably the study of the medieval period. Now, 19th century historians, of course, were not the most knowledgeable on things. They were just starting to uncover the past. And so a lot of tropes that we believe in today that are false started in the 19th century. Among those things that started in the 19th century is this interesting term called the 100 Years' War. During the 100 Years' War, people did not call it the 100 Years' War. How could they have? If I'm a peasant in 1348, I'm not going to think, oh yes, we're fighting the 100 Years' War. It won't end for another 100 years. So, how did we get here? The critical thinking lab piece of this is understanding how to look at this from multiple angles, and then how do we come to the most objective truth we possibly can. My goal with all of these videos, of course, isn't to just lecture at a camera. That would be really boring. My goal is to help people think more broadly about topics, think about them from different angles, and also have those aha moments that lead to better critical thinking skills, right? The aha of like, wow, I'd never thought of it that way before. All right, so let's first look at the so-called 100 Years' War and what's generally accepted as the unfolding of events. So the war is considered to have started in 1337 with an outbreak of hostilities between the King of England and the King of France. Now, what was the most consequential factor? A lot of people cite the 1328 death of the French king and subsequent succession crisis as the primary driver for the outbreak of hostilities. However, if we look at the history between 1328 and 1337, it's quite clear that the King of England contesting the French throne was not the primary motivator for the war, but rather probably French aggression. I say probably because we know that Edward III was quite vengeful, and so he probably did have resentment in his back pocket. So by the time 1337 came around, he was ready to go fight the French king. But the French king is the one who really made the first move by trying to annex Aquitaine, which belonged to the English king. Okay, wow, that's a lot of information. So let's pull back a little bit. So that's the beginning of the war. If that's the beginning of the war and it's already this muddy, you can tell why it's going to be difficult to delineate the 100 Years' War in any logical way. So let's go to the end of the war. So the end of the war is generally considered to have happened in 1453 with the Battle of Castillon, which is where the French finally expulsed the last of the English out of France, and France was whole again, which is actually a really funny thing to say, saying France is whole again. At the beginning of the war, France was not France as we see it today, or that we would see in 1453. So 1453 is considered the end of the war, period. Now, how did we come to these? Because we do know that before 1337, there was conflict between England and France. And we know that after 1453, there was conflict between England and France. So who decided that the war should begin with 1337, with the outbreak of violence between Edward III and Philip VI, and end in 1453 with the Battle of Castile? And that is a question for not looking at the 100 Years' War, but looking at 19th century history. So really what we're looking at is a tendency by historians starting in the 19th century to take history and try to cut it up in little digestible pieces. Essentially, it's a pedagogical issue. In order to teach something, you have to delineate it and separate it from the rest. So if we look at the broader conflicts that happened in the 14th and 15th centuries between the King of France and the King of England, it is very hard to separate them from the conflicts that happened in the 13th century and then would later happen in the 15th and 16th centuries. And now the beginning of this term, the 100 Years' War, started, of all places, you're never going to guess this, France. It started with a historian named Chrysanthe Ovide Desmichel in 1823, who is credited with publishing the first mention of the term. It was a way to delineate a series of conflicts that would take 3 phases to start and end in order to better teach them and digest them better. This is something you will learn through this channel happens a lot. Historians like to delineate things. I've talked at length about what this looks like with the Viking Age. The Viking Age started in 793 and ended in 1066, but did it? Were there Vikings not before 793? Were there not Vikings after 1066? Of course there were. History is more nebulous than the neat little categorizations that historians like to make. But this is what we have, because if we don't delineate, then it's really hard to talk about anything at all, right? So here we are, 1823 in France, la guerre des Cent Ans. Now, of course, leave it to a Frenchman to take a look and say, 116 years, let's make it an even 100. The precision's not quite there. Nothing against, I am French. I kid the French. I am French. So the next mention, of course, is in 1852 by a French historian, Jean-Louis Théodore Bachelet, who again mentions la guerre des Cent Ans, picking up from the previous historian. Now, by this time, the term hasn't caught on yet. When people look at the 14th century, they're thinking a series of conflicts starting in 1337, starting in 1328 with the death of the king, because that was kind of the trend in the 19th century. Like, oh, it was the death of the king and the succession crisis that started this whole thing off. So Jean-Louis Théodore Bachelet takes up the term again, and then that moves on a couple of years later in 1861 to Henri Dupré-Agier, who says La guerre des Cent Ans in his own work. So the French started picking up on this idea that, hey, it's this 100 Years' War. It's a sustained period of conflict that has a similar root cause and then can be delineated at the end. Basically, look at this period of time we found that we can put bookends on, right? That's essentially what they did. So then, how did it get into the English world? Because we don't call it La guerre des Cent Ans, we call it the 100 Years' War. So obviously, somebody in England figured this out and caught on to the trend. And it turns out that the 100 Years' War designation was very convenient for English historians to explain how England went from a continental power to an island nation. This is what's going to make the designation of 100 Years' War problematic in the Francophone world later. The French invented the term, the English took it and said, this is much more convenient for our history. And then the French said, this is bullshit. We will get back to that. So Edward Friedman is the first English historian to use the term 100 Years' War, and that's in the 1860s. Then we have John Richard Green, who picked it up in the 1870s, and those two together published a body of works that then popularized the term the 100 Years' War. And it stuck, and it hasn't unstuck. Now, to give you a sense of the changing nature of how historians are approaching the past, there have been attempts at redesignating the 100 Years' War. So a book by Dr. Michael Livingston titled The 200 Years' War has attempted to redelineate the 100 Years' War by adding all the stuff that came before. Now, there is a precedent to this. I don't want to say he came out of nowhere and said, you know what, we should just add the conflicts that happened in the 1310s and the 1300s and the 1290s and the 1280s and the 1270s to the 100 Years' War. There is a precedent. And in fact, I have that precedent here. I have this wonderful book. This is actually a little outdated itself, right? Jonathan Sumpton. It's a wonderful book, very complete, very long, but it's a narrative style, so it's accessible to just your casual history readers, so I recommend it if you haven't checked it out already. Jonathan Sumpton does admit the problem with the delineations that we inherited from the 19th century and explains all the different factors that occurred in the 1270s and 1280s and 1290s that did play a role in the outbreak of hostilities in 1337. So there has been a longstanding acknowledgement that the conflicts that came before the 100 Years' War directly impacted the start of the so-called 100 Years' War. So Mr. Livingston isn't wrong to attempt to redraw the lines, if you will. He has encountered some criticism that I saw online. Like I said, from a pedagogical standpoint, it's convenient to have the 100 Years' War, 1337 to 1453. And if students say, hey, wait a minute, that's not 100 years, they're paying attention. Do you hear that? He's paying attention. He did the math. That's a good thing for a teacher. Check for understanding. It's not 100 years. Sweet. Yes, I was a school teacher for a long time. So it's just so convenient from the teaching standpoint. But Mr. Livingston did try to do it, and the book is still very new. It's still being processed. It's still being peer-reviewed. It's still being critiqued. So we have time to see how his thesis will play out in the long term. I will not comment on the thesis right now myself because, admittedly, I have not read it. But I will. It's on my list. I just have, well, you know how it goes. I have a stack this tall of books that I need to read. It's never ending. Just keep adding. And it just keeps going. Anyhow, back to the main point. Now, from a critical thinking standpoint, here's the takeaway that I want you to have. Hopefully the aha moment. Whenever you see something in history that is a long-standing moniker or type of nomenclature, think Viking Age, think 100 Years' War, I want you to remember that historians like to delineate things. And so whenever you do see these delineations, just remember that generally they're done as a means to facilitate teaching. Basically, I'm going to create a curriculum on the 100 Years' War. It's going to be 10 weeks. Easy, cut, slice, put in. That's the pedagogical standpoint. But I want you to also think about and question, how else could this have been cut up? How else could this have been delineated? What factors pre-existed this delineation to start this so-called period, right? So the same is true of the Viking Age. The same is true of the 100 Years' War. The same is true of some of the earlier wars, the Crusades, for example. Everything's delineated by historians for a reason. Now, those reasons typically are okay. But is there a way to look at it where we could delineate differently? What's the idiomatic expression in English? There are different ways to skin this cat. I hope that's the right one. My idiomatic expressions aren't so good. There are different ways to skin this proverbial cat. Actually, before I go, I do want to say, let's think critically about these three periods between, right? So you have the 100 Years' War, and then you have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And each one has a different name, and they're all delineated differently. Could those delineations be done differently? And there's an argument to be made that yes, for example, the outbreak of hostilities in 1337 could be considered to have started in 1328 with the death of the king, the succession crisis. That very easily could be something you could do. The difference is there wasn't an immediate outbreak of hostilities, except that there were intermittent fights between nobles from the French side and nobles from the English side in Aquitaine, going in or around this and that. I mean, this was just kind of this constant rolling. We have to remember that there's a time where the fastest messenger is traveling 30 miles a day. So news doesn't travel quickly, so it takes time for things to unfold. So there were already conflicts happening in Aquitaine in 1328 that would then grow and then affect the start of hostilities between the King of England and the King of France in 1337. So already the first phase of the 100 Years' War, we could move some things around. So the big takeaway for today, was the 100 Years' War 100 years long? No. Could it have been 200 years long? Is the 100 Years' War an appropriate nomenclature for what happened? It works. But here's what I really want you to take away at the end of this video. Remember that historians like to delineate things, and it's okay to question if the delineation that you're seeing is appropriate.